The words hit me like a slap across the face. "You are nothing but a Leech, Madison." My Aunt Sarah's voice dripped with venom as she stood in the marble foyer of grandmother's estate. Around me, cousins nodded in agreement, their eyes cold and calculating. I had driven 8 hours to attend what I thought was a family gathering to discuss grandmother's will. Instead, I walked into an ambush. "You have contributed nothing to this family," my cousin Derek added, adjusting his expensive suit. "Grandmother left you money out of pity." The inheritance meeting was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes. What they did not know was that I had just discovered something that would change everything forever. Before we dive into this story of family betrayal and sweet justice, I would love to know where you are watching from. Are you Team Madison already, or do you think families always have your back? Hit that like button if you have ever felt like the black sheep, and do not forget to subscribe, because this inheritance drama is about to get absolutely wild. Trust me, you will not want to miss what happens when the truth finally comes out. 3 days before that devastating confrontation, I had been cleaning out my late mother's house in Portland, Oregon. Mom had passed away 6 months earlier, and I was finally ready to sort through her belongings. She had been the youngest of 4 siblings, always treated as the family disappointment because she chose to be a teacher instead of pursuing business like the rest of them. As I went through her desk, I found a manila envelope hidden in the back of the bottom drawer. Inside were bank statements, legal documents, and handwritten notes in my mother's careful script. My hands trembled as I read through them. For 23 years, my mother had been sending monthly payments to my Uncle Robert's construction company. The amount started small in 2001, just $500 a month. But by 2023, she was sending $3,000 monthly. The notes revealed the truth that made my stomach turn. When my grandfather died in 2001, he had left his construction business to his sons Robert and James equally. However, the business was struggling with debt. My mother, despite earning a modest teacher's salary, had used her inheritance money to keep the company afloat. She had essentially bought Robert and James out of bankruptcy, saving their reputations and their futures. But here was the part that made my blood boil. In return for her financial rescue, Robert and James had promised to ensure she received proper recognition in the family, and that her children would be treated equally when it came to future inheritance matters. Instead, they had taken her money for over 2 decades and told everyone that Mom was the family failure who needed constant help. The most damning document was a contract signed in 2002. Mom had loaned them $150,000 with the agreement that it would be repaid with interest by 2010. Not only had they never repaid a single penny, but they had also used her money to expand the business and purchase additional properties. The company that now generated millions annually had been built on my mother's sacrifice. I found receipts showing that Mom had even taken out a second mortgage on her house to help fund their projects. While Robert and James bought luxury cars and vacation homes, my mother had been quietly struggling to make ends meet. She had never told me any of this because she did not want to burden me with family drama. The final document was a letter Mom had written, but never sent, dated just 2 months before her death. In it, she detailed how she had repeatedly asked her brothers to acknowledge her contributions to the family business, especially as grandmother's health declined. She wanted to ensure that I would not be cut out of inheritance decisions, given how much she had invested in the family's success. The letter revealed that Robert and James had been manipulating grandmother against my mother for years. They told her that Mom was jealous of their success and was always asking for handouts. They painted themselves as the responsible ones who had built their wealth through hard work, while portraying my mother as the sister who could never get her life together. What made it worse was discovering that they had been using Mom's loan money to make large gifts to grandmother, which then made them appear more generous and worthy of larger inheritance shares. They were literally using my mother's money to buy grandmother's favor while simultaneously destroying my mother's reputation. I found bank records showing that even after Mom was diagnosed with cancer, she continued making payments to Robert's company. She was undergoing chemotherapy and struggling with medical bills, yet she honored her commitment to the family business that had made her brothers wealthy. The cruelest part was learning that Robert and James had convinced grandmother to change her will multiple times over the years, each time reducing what was left to my mother and increasing their own shares. They claimed it was because Mom was financially irresponsible and would just waste any inheritance money. As I sat on my mother's bedroom floor surrounded by these documents, I felt a rage unlike anything I had ever experienced. My mother had died believing she was the family disappointment, never knowing that I had discovered the truth about her incredible sacrifices. She had single-handedly saved the family business and made her brothers millionaires, only to be treated like a burden until her final breath. The invitation to the inheritance meeting suddenly made sense. They were planning to finalize grandmother's estate distribution, and I was sure they intended to give me some small token amount while justifying why I deserved so little. What they did not realize was that I now had evidence of massive fraud spanning over 2 decades. I spent the next 2 days making copies of every document and consulting with a lawyer. The attorney confirmed what I suspected. Robert and James had essentially stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from my mother and had committed fraud by misrepresenting their financial situation to grandmother. Armed with this knowledge, I drove to grandmother's estate for what they thought would be my humiliation. Instead, it was going to be the day their carefully constructed lies finally caught up with them. The inheritance meeting was held in grandmother's formal dining room, the same room where we had celebrated countless family holidays. Grandmother sat at the head of the long mahogany table, looking frail but sharp-eyed at 87. Her attorney, Mr. Patterson, sat to her right with a stack of legal documents. My aunts Sarah and Patricia flanked grandmother's left side, while my uncles Robert and James sat across from them with their wives. My cousins Derek, Michael, and Jennifer filled the remaining chairs, leaving me at the far end of the table like an afterthought. The seating arrangement alone spoke volumes about my position in the family hierarchy. Mr. Patterson began reading the will's provisions. As expected, Robert and James were set to inherit the largest portions, including grandmother's real estate properties and investment accounts. Sarah and Patricia each received substantial cash gifts and jewelry. My cousins were granted trust funds and specific valuable items. Then came my portion. To Madison Walsh, my late daughter Helen's child, I leave the sum of $25,000 and my collection of books. The amount was insulting considering grandmother's estate was worth over $4 million. Around the table I saw smug smiles and satisfied nods. That seems appropriate, Sarah said coolly, given that Helen never contributed much to the family success. Madison, you should be grateful, Robert added. 25,000 is more than generous considering you have never been involved in any family business matters. This was my moment. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the manila folder containing all of my mother's documents. Actually, I think there has been a serious misunderstanding about my mother's contributions to this family. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Robert's face went pale, and James suddenly found his hands very interesting to stare at. "What are you talking about?" Derek demanded. I placed the first document on the table. This is a contract signed by Robert and James Walsh in 2002, acknowledging receipt of $150,000 from my mother, Helen Walsh, to save their failing construction company from bankruptcy. Grandmother leaned forward, her eyes sharp. What construction company loan? The loan that was never repaid. I continued sliding more documents across the table. For 23 years, my mother sent monthly payments totaling over $600,000 to keep Robert and James afloat. Money that came from her inheritance, her teacher's salary, and even a second mortgage on her house. "That is ridiculous," James sputtered. "Helen never loaned us money. We helped her out occasionally when she was struggling." I laughed bitterly. "Really? Then please explain these bank statements showing direct transfers from her account to Robert Walsh Construction every month for over 2 decades. I spread the bank records across the table like a winning poker hand. The evidence was undeniable. Monthly transfers clearly documented with memo lines reading business loan payment and construction company support. Sarah grabbed one of the statements. "This has to be fake." "Feel free to call the bank," I replied calmly. These are official statements. I also have the original loan agreement with both brothers' signatures witnessed and notarized. Grandmother's attorney picked up the contract and examined it carefully. Mrs. Walsh, were you aware of this loan arrangement? I most certainly was not. Grandmother said, her voice sharp with anger. She fixed her gaze on Robert. You told me that Helen was constantly asking you boys for money. You said she was jealous of your success. Now wait just a minute, Robert began. But I cut him off. There is more, I said, producing my mother's handwritten notes. Mom kept detailed records of every conversation she had with you about repayment. She documented how you repeatedly promised to pay her back and how you convinced her to keep the loan secret to avoid family drama. I read directly from Mom's notes. Robert called today asking for another 3 months extension, says the business is about to land a big contract and he will pay me back with interest. Promised again that he would make sure Madison is treated fairly when the time comes. The room was dead silent, except for the ticking of Grandmother's antique clock. You want to know the really sick part? I continued, my voice growing stronger. While my mother was struggling to pay for cancer treatments, she continued sending you money. Even when she could barely afford her medications, she honored her commitment to this family. I pulled out the medical bills and bank statements from my mother's final months. Here are her chemotherapy bills, and here are the payments she made to Robert Walsh Construction during that same period. She chose to help you instead of reducing her own suffering. Jennifer, Robert's daughter, looked horrified. Dad, is this true? Robert opened his mouth, but no words came out. But wait, it gets better, I said, enjoying the growing panic in their eyes. I also have records showing that Robert and James used my mother's money to make large gifts to grandmother, which made them appear more generous and financially successful than they actually were. I produced the gift records I had cross-referenced with the loan payments. Every major birthday and Christmas gift you gave grandmother for the past 15 years was funded by money you stole from my mother. Grandmother's face was turning red with fury. You bought my affection with Helen's money. Mother, please, it was not like that, James pleaded. Then what was it like? I demanded. Because from where I sit, it looks like you built your entire fortune on my mother's sacrifice, then convinced grandmother that Mom was the family failure so you could maximize your inheritance. Mr. Patterson was frantically taking notes. Mrs. Walsh, if these allegations are accurate, this could significantly impact the will's provisions. Oh, they are accurate, I said. I have 23 years of documented fraud, bank records, contracts, correspondence, and witness statements from Mom's financial advisor, who tried to talk her out of continuing the payments. The family members were now looking at each other with suspicion and fear. The carefully maintained fiction of their success was crumbling before their eyes. You have no proof that we misled Mother about anything, Sarah said desperately. Actually, I do, I replied, pulling out my final piece of evidence. I found a recording device in my mother's house with several conversations she had with grandmother. Want to hear the one where Robert and James told her that Helen was always begging for handouts, while they were literally depositing her money into their accounts? The recorded conversations were devastating. My mother, suspicious in her final months that something was wrong, had begun secretly recording family phone calls. In one particularly damning conversation from last Christmas, Robert could be heard telling grandmother that my mother had called him crying about money again on the exact same day that she had transferred $3,000 to his business account. Helen just cannot manage money. His voice crackled through the old recording device. She spends everything and then expects us to bail her out. That is why she is always broke. Meanwhile, James could be heard in the background agreeing. She has never understood how to build wealth like we have. It is really sad, but some people just are not cut out for financial responsibility. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. Here were two men disparaging their sister's financial management while literally living off her money. Grandmother's face had gone from red to ashen. Turn that off, she whispered. But I was not done. There is another conversation from 2 months before Mom died. Want to hear Robert promising her that he would make things right with the inheritance, while privately telling his wife that they needed to convince you to reduce Mom's portion even further. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Derek finally spoke up. Even if this is all true, what do you want money? You cannot change the will now. Actually, Mr. Patterson interjected, if there was fraud involved in influencing Mrs. Walsh Sr.'s estate planning decisions, the will could potentially be contested and modified. I smiled. But I do not just want money, I want justice. And I want everyone to know exactly what kind of people you really are. That is when something unexpected happened. Jennifer Roberts' 28-year-old daughter suddenly stood up. I need to say something. Robert shot her a warning look. Jennifer, this is not the time. No, Dad, this is exactly the time, she said firmly. I have been feeling guilty about this for months. She turned to face me directly. Madison, I knew some of this was happening. Not all of it, but I knew your mom was helping Dad financially, and I knew he was not telling grandmother the truth about where his money was coming from. Jennifer, stop talking right now, Robert commanded. No, she shouted back. I am tired of being part of this lie. Madison, your mom called me last Christmas. She was crying because she could not afford to buy you a proper present. She had just paid Dad's loan payment, and it left her account almost empty. I felt terrible, but I did not know how to help without betraying my own father. The betrayal on Robert's face was palpable, but Jennifer continued. She asked me if I thought Dad would ever really pay her back because she was starting to worry about leaving you with nothing when she died. I told her I was sure he would, but honestly, I had never seen him make any effort to repay anything. This revelation cracked something open in the room. Suddenly, other family members began shifting uncomfortably, and I realized Jennifer might not be the only one who had suspected something. Patricia. My aunt cleared her throat. I need to be honest, too. Helen called me several times over the years, asking if I thought Robert and James were taking advantage of her generosity. I told her she was being paranoid, but deep down, I wondered why my successful brothers never seemed to have their own money for family emergencies. Patricia, Sarah hissed. What? It is true. Every time there was a family crisis or someone needed help, it was always Helen who stepped up with money, never Robert or James, despite their supposedly thriving business. Michael James's son looked sick. Dad, you told me you built the company from nothing. You said it was your hard work and smart investments that made us wealthy. James could not meet his son's eyes. It was more complicated than that. No, it was not, I interjected. It was simple fraud and manipulation. You stole my mother's money, used it to build your fortune, and then convinced everyone she was the family burden. Mr. Patterson was writing furiously. Mrs. Walsh, given these revelations, I strongly recommend we postpone finalizing the estate distribution pending a thorough investigation. But grandmother surprised everyone by speaking up in a voice stronger than I had heard all day. There will be no postponement. Patricia, call my other attorney, the one who handled your father's estate. I want a new will drawn up immediately. Mother, please, Robert pleaded. Let us explain. Explain what? She snapped. How you stole from your dying sister? How you used her money to buy my love? How you made me believe she was the failure when she was actually the most generous person in this family? The emotional weight was crushing, but I pressed on because I knew I had more allies than I initially realized. Jennifer, Patricia, Michael, I need your help. This is not just about money. This is about making sure my mother's sacrifice is acknowledged and that this kind of manipulation never happens again. Jennifer nodded immediately. What do you need? First, I need witness statements from anyone who suspected what was happening. Second, I need help gathering any other financial records that might be relevant. And third, I need support when this goes public because I'm not keeping this family secret anymore. Patricia looked nervous but determined. What do you mean go public? I mean I'm filing a formal complaint with the district attorney's office. What Robert and James did was not just morally wrong, it was criminal fraud. They obtained money under false pretenses and influenced an estate through deception. The room erupted in panicked voices, but I had found my coalition. Jennifer and Patricia were clearly on my side, and Michael seemed to be wavering toward joining us. Even some of the other cousins were looking at their fathers with new suspicion. But I knew this was just the beginning. Robert and James had 23 years of practice in manipulation and deception. They were not going to give up without a fight, and I suspected they had more tricks up their sleeves. What I did not anticipate was how dirty they were willing to play, or how one of my newfound allies was about to betray me in the worst possible way. 3 days after the explosive inheritance meeting, I thought I had momentum on my side. Jennifer had agreed to provide a written statement about what she knew Patricia was gathering old family correspondence that might support my case, and Michael was questioning everything he had believed about his father's business success. I had scheduled a meeting with Detective Sarah Morrison from the Financial Crimes Unit, who seemed genuinely interested in pursuing fraud charges against Robert and James. Everything was falling into place until Jennifer called me at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday night, crying hysterically. "Madison, I am so sorry," she sobbed into the phone. "I cannot do this anymore. I cannot destroy my family." My stomach dropped. "Jennifer, what are you talking about?" We agreed that the truth needed to come out. "Dad sat me down tonight with the whole family. He showed me documents that prove your mom was lying about some of the loans. He says she was actually borrowing money from them and then claiming it was the other way around when she got confused from the cancer medications." I felt like I had been punched in the gut. "Jennifer, you know that is not true. You saw the evidence yourself." "But what if I was wrong?" she continued crying. "What if the cancer treatments really did mess with her memory? Dad showed me emails where your mom was asking for help with bills. Maybe she got confused about who owed what to whom." I realized what was happening. Robert had spent 3 days crafting a counter-narrative, probably with help from a lawyer, designed to make my mother look like a confused cancer patient who had mixed up the financial details. It was brilliant and absolutely despicable. "Jennifer, think about what you told me at the meeting. You said my mom called you crying because she could not afford Christmas presents after making a payment to your dad. Does that sound like someone who was receiving help or someone who was giving it?" "I do not know anymore," she whispered. "Dad says I misunderstood that conversation. He says your mom was emotional because she was proud of being able to help the family business despite her illness, and that I interpreted her tears wrong." Over the next hour, Jennifer systematically walked back every piece of support she had offered. Robert had convinced her that supporting my case would destroy the family business, put dozens of employees out of work, and ruin the lives of her cousins who had done nothing wrong. But the worst part came at the end of our conversation. "Madison, there is something else. Dad hired a private investigator to look into your finances. He found out that you have been struggling with credit card debt and that you were behind on rent payments last year. He is going to argue that you fabricated this whole story because you are desperate for money." The betrayal cut deep because Jennifer was right about my financial struggles. As a freelance graphic designer, my income was inconsistent, and my mother's medical bills had drained most of my savings. Robert was going to use my legitimate financial stress to undermine my credibility. "So you are abandoning me because your father hired someone to dig up dirt on my private life." "I am not abandoning you. I just think maybe we should let the lawyers handle this quietly instead of making it a public scandal." After Jennifer hung up, I sat in my dark apartment feeling more alone than I had since my mother died. My strongest ally had just switched sides, taking with her the insider knowledge that had made my case so compelling. The next morning brought worse news. Patricia called to tell me she was also withdrawing her support. "Madison, honey, I talked to my own lawyer and he says this could open up legal problems for me too. If there really was fraud involved, I might be considered complicit for not reporting it earlier." Within 48 hours, my coalition had completely crumbled. Michael stopped returning my calls. Even the cousins who had seemed sympathetic at the meeting were now avoiding me entirely. Detective Morrison called on Friday afternoon with devastating news. "Ms. Walsh, I am afraid we cannot pursue charges at this time. Without witness statements from family members, and given that the alleged victims are deceased, we do not have sufficient evidence to build a case." "But what about all the bank records and contracts?" Those documents could be interpreted multiple ways, especially if family members are claiming the payments were legitimate business transactions or gifts. We would need someone with direct knowledge of fraudulent intent to testify. Robert and James had successfully intimidated everyone into silence. They had turned my moment of triumph into a humiliating defeat, and they had done it by exploiting the very family loyalty that my mother had always believed in. That weekend, I received a call from grandmother's attorney. Ms. Walsh, I am calling to inform you that Mrs. Walsh Sr. has decided to maintain the original will provisions. However, she is increasing your inheritance to $50,000 as a gesture of goodwill. $50,000. It was double the original amount, but it was also clearly meant to buy my silence. The message was obvious. Take the money and drop the fraud allegations, or risk losing everything in a prolonged legal battle I could not afford. I spent Sunday afternoon walking through the cemetery where my mother was buried, talking to her headstone about how badly I had failed her. I am sorry, Mom. I thought I could get justice for you, but they are too powerful and I am too alone. For the first time since discovering the truth, I seriously considered taking grandmother's offer and walking away. Robert and James had won by doing what they did best, manipulating people through fear, guilt, and financial pressure. But as I sat there in the growing darkness, I remembered something my mother used to tell me when I was facing bullies in school. Honey, the right thing to do is still the right thing even when it is hard. I was not ready to give up yet, but I needed help from someone who could not be intimidated by my uncles. I needed someone with nothing to lose and everything to gain from seeing the truth come out. I just had no idea that help was about to come from the most unexpected source imaginable. Monday morning brought a phone call that changed the entire game. Is this Madison Walsh? This is Eleanor Patterson, and I believe we need to talk. I recognized the last name immediately. She was related to Mr. Patterson, grandmother's attorney, but I could not place how. I am Harold Patterson's ex-wife, she explained. We divorced last year, and during the proceedings, I discovered some very interesting files in his home office that I think you need to see. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown that afternoon. Eleanor was a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, with silver hair and the demeanor of someone who had been seriously wronged. She carried a briefcase that she set carefully on the table between us. Before I show you these documents, you need to understand something. Harold and I were married for 35 years. He handled your grandmother's legal affairs for most of that time, and he was not always as ethical as he pretended to be. She opened the briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. These are copies of correspondence between Harold and your uncles dating back to 2005. They knew exactly what they were doing to your mother, and Harold helped them cover it up. The first document was a letter from Robert to Mr. Patterson dated 2006. In it, Robert expressed concern that my mother might eventually demand repayment of her loans and asked for advice on how to protect the family business from Helen's emotional volatility. Mr. Patterson's written response was damning. I recommend documenting any financial assistance Helen provides as gifts rather than loans. If questioned later, you can claim she was voluntarily supporting the family business without expectation of repayment. This is legal advice on how to commit fraud, I breathed. Eleanor nodded grimly. It gets worse. Look at this one from 2012. The next letter showed James asking Mr. Patterson to help convince grandmother to reduce my mother's inheritance share. The justification was that Mom was financially irresponsible and would waste any significant inheritance. Mr. Patterson's response included a strategy for gradually poisoning grandmother against my mother. Document any requests Helen makes for family financial support, no matter how small. Present these to your mother as evidence of Helen's poor money management. Over time, this will build a case for reducing her inheritance portion. They were systematically destroying my mother's reputation based on the lawyer's advice, I said, feeling sick. There is more, Eleanor continued. Harold kept detailed billing records for this advice. Your uncles paid him over $40,000 over the years specifically for help with inheritance planning and asset protection against family member claims. She showed me the billing statements, which clearly itemized services like consultation on loan documentation issues, advice on influencing estate beneficiary, and strategy for minimizing inheritance disputes. But the most shocking document was a memo Mr. Patterson had written to himself in 2020, just 2 years ago. In it, he detailed a conversation where Robert had asked about the statute of limitations on informal family loans and whether Helen's death would resolve any potential repayment obligations. Harold wrote that he advised them Helen's death would essentially eliminate any loan repayment issues as long as no one else in the family had documentation proving the loans existed. I stared at the memo. They were counting on my mother dying without anyone knowing the truth. Exactly, and Harold helped them plan for it. Eleanor's motivation for helping me became clear as she continued. During our divorce, I discovered that Harold had been hiding assets from me for years. When I confronted him about these files, he claimed attorney-client privilege and tried to have them sealed. But I made copies before the court order went through. Why are you giving these to me? Because I spent 35 years married to a man who helped wealthy people cheat their own families. I want to see him face consequences for once. The evidence Eleanor provided was a game changer. It proved that Robert James and their attorney had conspired to defraud my mother and manipulate grandmother's estate decisions. This was not just family drama anymore. It was documented criminal conspiracy. But Eleanor had one more surprise for me. Madison there is someone else you need to meet. Harold was not the only lawyer involved in this scheme. She made a phone call, and 20 minutes later, a woman in her 40s joined us at our table. Madison, this is Rebecca Walsh. She is Robert's ex-daughter-in-law. Rebecca had been married to Derek Roberts' oldest son until their divorce 2 years earlier. During their marriage, she had worked as a bookkeeper for Robert Walsh Construction and had access to the company's financial records. I always wondered why the company books never quite made sense, Rebecca explained. There were regular large deposits that Robert would never explain properly. He just said they were family investments and told me not to ask questions. She pulled out her own folder of documents. When Derek and I divorced, I kept copies of the financial records because I wanted to make sure he was not hiding assets from me. Now I realize those mysterious deposits were payments from your mother. Rebecca's records corroborated everything I had discovered, but they also revealed additional fraud. Look at this, she said, pointing to a spreadsheet. Robert was claiming your mother's loan payments as business income on the company's tax returns, but he never reported them as debt obligations. What does that mean? Eleanor answered. It means he was committing tax fraud in addition to everything else. He was getting the cash benefit of the loans without acknowledging the legal obligation to repay them. With Eleanor and Rebecca's evidence, I now had documentation of a 20-year criminal conspiracy involving fraud, tax evasion, and elder abuse. More importantly, I had credible witnesses who could not be intimidated by Robert and James because they had already lost everything they could lose. We need to take this to the FBI, Eleanor said firmly. This is federal fraud at this point. As we sat in that coffee shop planning our next move, I felt something I had not experienced since my mother's death hope. Not just for justice, but for the possibility that the truth might actually matter more than money and family politics. Robert and James thought they had won by turning my allies against me. What they did not realize was that their own greed and paranoia had created a paper trail that would ultimately destroy them. The FBI investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Agent Maria Santos, who specialized in financial crimes, told me later that cases with this much documentation were rare and prosecutors loved them. When criminals keep detailed records of their crimes, our job becomes much easier. Within 6 weeks, federal agents had executed search warrants on Robert Walsh Construction, James's real estate company, and Mr. Patterson's law office. They seized computers, financial records, and communication files dating back 15 years. The criminal charges were filed on a cold Tuesday morning in March. Robert and James were each charged with mail fraud, wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. Mr. Patterson faced additional charges of legal malpractice and aiding criminal activity. The indictments detailed over $800,000 in fraudulent activity spanning 2 decades. But the real satisfaction came when the story hit the local news. The headline read, "Local Construction Dynasty Built on Fraud Against Dying Sister." The reporter had interviewed Eleanor and Rebecca, and their testimony painted a devastating picture of greed and manipulation. Jennifer called me the day the story broke, crying again, but this time with remorse. "Madison, I am so sorry I did not believe you. I am so ashamed that I let my father convince me to abandon you." "I understand why you did it," I told her, and I genuinely did. Family loyalty is complicated when the family is corrupt. The civil case moved parallel to the criminal proceedings. With the FBI evidence supporting my claims, grandmother immediately changed her will. She left Robert and James each only $10,000, with a note stating, "For their betrayal of family trust." The bulk of her estate was redistributed among the grandchildren who had not participated in the fraud. But more importantly to me, grandmother established the Helen Walsh Memorial Foundation with $500,000 to provide financial assistance to teachers facing medical emergencies. My mother's sacrifice was finally being honored in a way that would help other people. The criminal trial lasted 3 weeks. Eleanor, Rebecca, and I all testified about the evidence we had uncovered. Jennifer also testified, admitting that she had initially tried to protect her father despite knowing he was wrong. Robert and James maintained their innocence until the very end, claiming they were loving brothers who had tried to help their struggling sister. But the documented evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Robert received 4 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay full restitution, plus penalties totaling over $1.2 million. James got 3 years and owed $800,000 in restitution. Mr. Patterson was disbarred and sentenced to 18 months. The restitution payments meant that Robert Walsh Construction and James's real estate company had to be sold to pay back what they owed. The irony was perfect. The businesses built with my mother's money were liquidated to repay the debt they had always owed her. But beyond the money and the justice, something more important happened during those months of investigation and trial. I found a new family among the people who had helped me fight for the truth. Eleanor became like a surrogate aunt, sharing stories about building a new life after divorce and betrayal. Rebecca and I bonded over our shared experience of discovering that people we trusted had been lying to us for years. Even Jennifer, after working through her guilt and shame, became a genuine ally and friend. We started having monthly dinners together, celebrating what Eleanor called our chosen family. These were people who had proven their loyalty through actions, not just blood relations. I also learned something crucial about myself during this process. For years, I had believed that I was the family disappointment, just like my mother had been portrayed. Fighting for justice taught me that sometimes being the difficult family member actually means being the only honest one. My mother never got to see her reputation restored or her sacrifices acknowledged. But I like to think she would be proud that her documentation and careful record-keeping eventually brought down the people who exploited her kindness. The $50,000 from grandmother's original will became $350,000 after the estate was redistributed. I used part of it to pay off my debts, but I also donated a significant portion to the Helen Walsh Memorial Foundation. I wanted to honor my mother's legacy of helping others, even when it cost her personally. 6 months after the trial ended, I visited my mother's grave again. This time, I brought flowers and a copy of the newspaper article about the foundation established in her name. "You were not the family failure, Mom," I told her headstone. "You were the family hero, and now everyone knows it." The experience taught me that justice is not always immediate, and it does not always come from the places you expect. Sometimes you have to fight for it yourself, and sometimes you have to be willing to lose everything to gain what really matters. I often get asked if I would do it all again, knowing how painful and difficult the process was. The answer is absolutely yes. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible. Truth matters. Justice matters. And sometimes, if you are brave enough to stand up for both, you discover that you are stronger than you ever imagined. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what was right? Have you experienced that moment when you realized someone you trusted was not who you thought they were? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about family betrayal and finding the courage to seek justice. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about karma justice and finding strength in impossible situations. Share this with anyone who needs to hear that standing up for truth is always worth it, even when it costs everything. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and remember that sometimes the family that matters most is the one you choose, not the one you were born into.